I wish y'all came to class that chipper. Yeah. You could do it on Sunday night. That would be just fine. Then you could say, well, if you brought me treats up here, I guess we need to bring a bag of sweet tarts or something. I don't know. Caffeine. Ooh, coffee. That would be good. Yeah. All right. Tonight we're not really tiptoeing into Haggai. We are going to do a little bit of history work this evening. Everybody's favorite thing. But if we're going to work in our post-exilic prophets, these are the prophets that were working after Judah comes back from Babylon. All right. We need to lay down a little bit of history just so we kind of know what's going on before we get into Haggai, maybe Ezra and some of the others. Just so we got a firm grasp of what's taking place here. So the first date, and this is just every Bible student needs to know this, 586 BC. Somebody tell me what happened in 586 BC. Anyone? Commit this to memory. That is year captivity. In the Old Testament, we kind of hammer down and say, supported well enough that we've got some pretty concrete support for those dates. Each time Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The city was besieged. Destruction of the walls. Here, but so 586. Waves, it's going to take. Yes, but this is when we associate the temple being removed. Now, some of the kings had already gotten into the temple. They would have to pay off some of their adversaries, pay tribute. They're plating everything and making items out of. Really mentioned. And so it's hard to discern when it was taken. If it was one of the earlier. Google. It's interesting if you like that kind of thing. Next date we want to be familiar with is 539. This is going to be another significant date, and 539, 538 as well. And it's these events that kind of help get us there. So this is going to be a little bit of a lengthy. We got two kind of lengthy readings, but we'll make it all right here. But here in Daniel chapter 5 is where we're going to start. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. All right, you kind of wrap our minds around what's happening here. We have Belshazzar here. Now, he's called the son of Nebuchadnezzar several times. The fact is, it's kind of hard to hammer that out. Sometimes the language is like we see in some other Old Testament passages where you'll have a king that's about 4 generations removed from another king, and he's called his son. It's just kind of the way they talked. It would seem like there might be 2 or 3, maybe other kings between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, but there's also ways to argue around that because there's a little bit of espionage. A lot of those kings only reigned for a year or 2. And the fact is, as historians this is a point of contention, is hammering out these last few Babylonian kings before we get into the Persian kings. So for now, Belshazzar, we're going to call him the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Just keep in mind, if you're ever studying outside of Daniel here, you may find some other names in that kingly timeline beneath Nebuchadnezzar before you get to Belshazzar. All right, so they got a party going, right? That's their scene. Belshazzar's throwing a party, and he's getting about as blasphemous as you can, bringing in the holy items from the temple, drinking out of them, and they're having a big time, right? And then on top of that, verse 4, they're praising gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It's never a great scenario. We could argue that still goes on in just a little bit different shape right now. Verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palaces opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. The king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, his knees knocked together. And y'all like scary movies? Anybody like scary movies? Got a scary movie, all right. You're in a room, and a hand. Yeah, everybody's familiar with Adam's family, right? And it, the hand is just, its name is It, I think. A hand starts writing in the plaster on the wall. We can kind of understand why the king's color changed, right? He probably got pretty white-faced. His limbs gave way. His knees knocked together. So we have the scene, right? That's scary. That's not normal. Even here in Babylon, a hand appearing and writing on a wall is not a normal, everyday occurrence. He's scared. Verse 7, the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be third ruler in the kingdom. And all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. He's changing colors again. I don't know what color he is now, but he's still frantic, right? He's in a worried state of mind. All of his go-to guys cannot tell him what's going on here, all right? There's confusion, there's fear. It's a scene of panic. Verse 11, let's back up. I believe this is his mother, if I remember right. Somebody can back me up and look that up if you got your Bibles open there. There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, astrologers. And because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. I think it's interesting by now, some time has passed. Daniel is not a young guy anymore. Maybe Daniel had been exalted pretty high under Nebuchadnezzar, right? He's had a pretty high station. But for Belshazzar to not know who he is, maybe that's just an inclination that Daniel had already started backing away. Maybe he had already kind of getting out of the political game a little bit, taking things easy, maybe an early retirement sort of thing. I'm not sure, but this Belshazzar should know Daniel. And as closely related as the text makes Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, he should be well aware of who Daniel is, because we're going to find out here in a moment that he should have known more than what he let on anyway. So we're going to call Daniel, and he's going to show the interpretations. Verse 16, we have Belshazzar speaking to Daniel. I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make it known to me, its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. But nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, here we go. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. And this is when Nebuchadnezzar, this is kind of the height of his game. As a ruler over Babylon at the time, he was one of the greatest kings the earth had seen. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind. His mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. Now, the passage in Daniel that's being recounted here is one of those great passages about the sovereignty of God. The passage that we're reading now is dealing with Belshazzar. Same thing. It's one of those passages that illustrates the sovereignty of God. It is political season. Doesn't really matter who's sitting in the Oval Office. God is still in charge. He's no less sovereign today than he was then. I don't get worked up so much over politics. So here you have a situation where the son has witnessed the father. He was lifted up, but now he's been made low. If you remember right, he had that seemed like feathers and long hair. He kind of looked like an ox, but there was parts of him that looked like an eagle as well. I mean, God had transformed him into something pretty amazing and beastly, right? Verse 22, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. And this is kind of where we see that Belshazzar had to be around during some of this. Now, he's either around or something that he should have been taught, but Daniel thinks that Belshazzar should have known. He should be familiar with the pride of Nebuchadnezzar, the fall of Nebuchadnezzar, and the re-exaltation of Nebuchadnezzar. Because when God brings him back, Nebuchadnezzar is kind of a different guy, right? He's a little more humble and a little bit more praising of the God of Daniel. Verse 22, you've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his house have been brought in before you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. That is, talk about Nathaniel. Is that right? Confronting David over sin with Bathsheba. Nathaniel doesn't sound right to me. Nathan. I was making it too long. Nathan confronting David is one of those harsh rebukes. This is right there with it. This is pretty harsh. You've been glorifying all these idols who don't see or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, in all your ways you have not honored. Wow, that's harsh. From his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. So there's where the hand came from the God of the Hebrews, the God of those tribe of Judah that has been brought over from Jerusalem, right? This was the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. There's some scary passages in Scripture. Verse 27 right there is in the top 3 or 4. It's right up there with Matthew 7 and Jesus talking about those that call upon his name, but they're going to be turned back at the gate. That's a pretty scary passage. All right, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. I read all that really just to get here, but that being one of my favorite parts of Daniel, I wanted to read all of it anyway. That is where the Babylonian kings end and then the Medo-Persian kings begin. Right? We have Darius. Darius isn't going to reign very long. We're going to have Cyrus that follows this up. It's going to happen rather quickly. It's going to be some quick turnover, and then we're going to get into the Persian kings. All right, and Cyrus, that's Persian. So Darius the Mede, there's still a lot of debate about this Darius. Darius is also the one who, unfortunately, he was tricked into throwing Daniel into the lion's den. That's next chapter. So this is a pretty significant date. If you're looking at your notes, you see that that was 539 BC, and then in 538, just the next year. Now, you know how dates can work. This could be as much as 2 years later, and that's kind of the guesstimate. It may not be 24 months, maybe 18 months, maybe 20 months kind of a thing on our calendar. We have the change to Cyrus. So we're going to jump to Ezra. Chapter 1, this is the way Ezra starts. We'll probably come back and study Ezra after we work through Haggai and maybe Zechariah. But Ezra 1 through 3, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, all of his people, may God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And so this 538 and 539, these dates, this is the changeover in the kingdom. This is kind of what precipitates the return of Judah, being able to go back to Jerusalem. That's why it's significant. That whole story about Belshazzar and his pride, right? The historical account is pretty great. Babylon is overthrown by the Medes and Persians. historically, they claim that the only way into Babylon, because of its fortified walls and all that, was through the Euphrates, flowed through the middle of it, right? They diverted the flow of the Euphrates River. How in the world you divert the flow of an entire river? But that's evidently what they did, and they marched in. And evidently, the citizens of Babylon disliked Belshazzar so much that they welcomed with open arms Darius the Mede in there. So if you like to study the history part of it, you study the Persian takeover of Babylon. That is really interesting stuff. It's really good. All right, so the reason we did that was because that's the change that precipitates the return, right? The change in rulership. So when Cyrus comes in, the normal operating procedure for the Persians was their conquered peoples just to send them home. When they got to Babylon, it wasn't just the Jewish people that got to go back home. It was all of those peoples at Babylon, the Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kings, had gathered. They sent them all back. The Cyrus cylinder, if you want to really dig into that some, the Cyrus cylinder has a lot of these proclamations in it. And so that's how we know a lot of these things. But there's multiple sources. Cyrus cylinder is one of the most famous. All right, so we got through the event that facilitated the change in king in Babylon. And so the next step is, so we associate 538 with the return. That's when Israelites begin returning back to Jerusalem. Happens in waves, and so they're not all back. Some are going to go back. Some are going to start working on the temple, working on the walls of Jerusalem, but they kind of fizzle out. That's where Haggai picks up. We'll turn back to Ezra in chapter 5, and you kind of learn as much in Ezra about what's going on, but the idea is they got discouraged, quit building on the temple, and then Haggai and Zechariah began prophesying, and Zerubbabel kind of kicked in, took charge, and started overseeing the rebuild. So it took place. So Ezra chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, the prophets Haggai, which is the one we're about to study, and Zechariah, the one we'll probably look at next, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Yeshua, the son of Jozadak, arose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. And so that's where we see the post-exilic prophets begin really picking up. So we're going to have Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, and others that we're going to talk about. We're not going to cover all of them probably, but this gets us through the narrative. This just gets us into what's happening, right? So, overall timeline here on the screen. Cyrus decree. That is I can't even see that print so small on my screen. 538 BC. Zerubbabel. Temple altar rebuilt 536. Temple construction goes on pause there in about 535. That's when they sort of kind of, they get disgruntled. And then Haggai and Zechariah begin prophesying. Zerubbabel picks back up, and temple rebuilding resumes. And 5 years later, the new temple is finished. On the dates. What was that first date we gave you? Of 86, 586. So let's see, the temple is completed in 515. Right there, 586 minus 515 is about 71 years. Saw and witnessed Solomon's temple, and then once this temple was rebuilt, they cried, because it could not compare with what Solomon had built. It's just they couldn't. They didn't have the resources that Solomon had, right? And so the glory that was associated with Solomon's temple is not with this one. And this one's going to stand until Herod remodels it for him. He's going to build a structure that's far bigger than Solomon's. It's not going to be as elaborate. It's not going to contain all the gold and all that Solomon's did, but it's going to be Solomon's. But anyway, so that's where we're going to get to, is the Second Temple, is what we're going to call it. The Second Temple period is what it's known as. And so Haggai is going to, and it's just 2 chapters, and so it's not going to take much to get through. Haggai is one of the prophets that helped encourage the participation. So we'll look at him next week. You have any thoughts, any questions? This is sort of just basic timeline stuff that we need to, and historical events that we need to kind of be a little bit familiar with if we're going to study familiar with the date of the deportation, the date of the return, the Cyrus decree, as we call it. So it kind of helps wrap your mind around what's happening when, right? Gets us a picture. Any questions? I may condense those dates down and put them on the next note sheet just so we have something a little more clear and accessible for you. With That guy's only 2 chapters. You can probably read it through.